who is reading this when it was written, and what is its legacy been over its history in terms of who's having access to it? And I guess a parallel question is, you recognized at the outset that the current contemporary PRC government is trying to limit the use of this text.
Yeah.
And I would be curious as to understand why you think that is. I mean, I know that histories are sensitive, and this period of history is particularly sensitive. But given the things that you said about, the Qing as being an extractive colonial empire, you think that that would sort of chime with some of the things that the Communist Party was trying to say about the reasons why the party is a liberating and just, rule. And I just, what reasons do they have for wanting to stifle this story?
It's really one question, because you're talking about what's been the reception of the text over the past century.
Pretty
right?
much, yeah.
So Sayrami in his time, he wrote this text, I think, basically for his friends and people like him. Other Turkic Muslim people who had one way or another experienced this period, and many of whom had been forced to collaborate with the new Qing state. We don't really know what Sayrami did in the last decades of his life, but I suspect he worked for the Qing for a while. That's probably how he learned his Chinese. But it was received in many ways. So first of all, the earliest known copy of this we actually have is a printed version made in Kazan in Tatarstan in Russia, which is interesting. Okay, so that version began to circulate among intellectuals in the Russian Empire and maybe Muslim intellectuals, and I think it found its way back to Xinjiang eventually, where cosmopolitan Uyghur elites started to think of this as the essential chronicle of their own recent history. And that's where I think, from the 1930s onward, it became the quintessential history. Not just because it's a really well-written history, but because it had been formalized by printing. But that's the earliest version. And Sayrami kept expanding his text and selling copies of it, sometimes to foreign travelers, but sometimes copies were made locally. And it's very clear that this text is found all across East Turkestan, in different places. It was copied for various reasons. Sayrami is very critical, especially, of 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗏, the Hokkandi warlord who established an emirate of Kashgaria from 1865 to 1877, and writes him as a tyrannical figure who was inevitably going to cause his own downfall. Sayrami is critical of his own friends, the initial leaders of the uprising, the 𝗏𝗏𝗄s, who he says, they're Sufis, they're Islamic mystics, they have no business running a state, right? He's very critical of all these people. But we have evidence that sometimes this text was copied by people locally in order to celebrate these same figures. Maybe they're not reading the critical tone in Sayrami's analysis. They might only copy the part about 𝗏𝗏𝗿, right? And see this as a celebratory act. In fact, we know this from one copy of it. There's marginalia saying that this was copied in celebration of the return of one of his sons. So it was received in different ways. Now, we only know about, if we extrapolate it, at least 12 manuscripts, which, as Ryan has pointed out to me, isn't really that many in the scheme of things. We don't know how this was read, though. We don't know if it was read out to people. We don't know if there are more copies we're not aware of. It probably wasn't as popular as, say, the hagiographical tradition, but it did circulate much more than I'd expected, and some of the copies are written in a really rough hand, suggesting that this wasn't just for the elite of elites, it was also for a broader reading public who might celebrate this past. Now, later on, of course. Okay, so this version, the latest version that I worked from, was collected and somehow ended up in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, where it was initially translated in the 1950s, actually. There's a secret Chinese translation from the 50s no one's seen. And as you're suggesting, this history of anti-Qing imperialism used to be very much in harmony with the Chinese Communist Party's ideology until very, very recently. The Qing was the villain of history because they were imperialist, plain and simple. And China had moved beyond that. Plus, Sayrami was able to provide information about Uyghur society, right? So through the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, you could find translations of this text, especially by Enver Baytur, an Uyghur Kyrgyz scholar from Xinjiang, which were widely read and widely available on bookshelves. But around, I want to say, 2010, 2011, there was a very bad Chinese translation made of this text. It's an atrociously poor translation. It's missing parts. When the translator didn't understand a phrase, he just skipped it. He mistranslates things. And some of the formal language, that's sort of just a boilerplate, is translated as though it's extremist Islamist rhetoric. And I think the Chinese translation started giving the impression that Sayrami was kind of some kind of extremist, which obviously, from my discussion, he wasn't, right? And so, by the time I gave a talk on this in Xinjiang in 2015, I got a lot of comments from the audience saying, I've read this text, he's an extremist, he's an Islamist. And now, it was around the same time that, they were trying to ban the use of Uyghur sources for Xinjiang history in universities. And of course, now, any departure from official history can be seen as an extremist separatist act, things like this. So the most recent translation of this text into Uyghur is actually published abroad by 𝗶𝗳𝗶𝗿, former professor at Minso University, who now lives in the US, and it was published in Istanbul, right? Even though it was based on work that he'd done and that was funded by the state in China. There's been a sudden turn in fortunes and a real attempt to quash anything that seems like an independent history of the region from a different perspective. That's the short answer.